The beings who called themselves archivists had existed before the first stars learned how to burn. They lived in the spaces between realities, where time moved in circles and straight lines at the same moment. They were not gods. Gods needed believers. The archivists needed only questions. For billions of years, they had watched the universe make life. They had seen creatures rise from mud and reach for the sky. They had watched empires of light spread across galaxies, and they had watched those same empires fall into dust. Every species followed patterns. Every civilization fit into their equations. The archivists could predict the rise and fall of worlds the way humans might predict the sunrise. Then they found Earth. Was young by archivist standards, only 400 million years old. They had been assigned to a small spiral galaxy, a routine task that should have taken no more than a few thousand years. But when they turned their attention to a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star, their equations broke. The species called itself humanity. They were fragile things made of water and carbon, living for barely 100 years before their bodies failed. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no venom. They could not fly. They could not breathe underwater. They could not survive the cold of space or the heat of their own sun. By every measure the archivists used, humans should have died out long ago. But they had not died. They had spread across their planet and begun reaching for others, and the way they had done it made no sense. Ran the simulations again and again. They fed every piece of data about human history into their prediction matrix. Wars that killed millions, plagues that swept across continents, famines that left entire generations hollow and starving, ice ages, floods, the slow poisoning of their own air and water. Every simulation said the same thing. Humans should have given up. They should have laid down in the darkness and waited for the end. Instead, they built hospitals. They wrote poetry. They planted gardens in the ruins of bombed cities. They sent machines to other planets and signals to other stars, hoping someone might answer. Brought their findings to the Elder Council. The Council had not gathered in 3 billion years. When they did, it was to witness the birth of new universes or the death of old ones. They did not gather for single species on single planets. But they gathered for this. The Council existed as shapes that had no names in any human language. They were older than concepts like up and down, older than the idea of before and after. When they spoke, their words moved through like waves through water. "Show us," they said. So showed them. A woman in a city that had been bombed for 300 days straight. Her home was gone. Her husband was gone. Half the children in her neighborhood were gone. But every morning she walked to a basement where 30 children waited, and she taught them to read. When the bombs fell too close, they would huddle together and she would tell them stories about a future where the sky was quiet and the bread was warm. She did not know if that future would ever come. She taught them anyway. A scientist in a laboratory, working 18 hours a day on a cure for the disease that was eating her own body. She had 6 months to live, maybe less. The cure, if it worked, would take years to develop. She would never benefit from it. But every night she wrote in her journal about the people who might be saved after she was gone, and every morning she returned to work. A line of refugees walking across a desert toward a border that might not accept them. They had lost everything. Their homes, their families, their country. They carried almost nothing. But among the few things they held were seeds. Seeds for vegetables and fruits and flowers. Seeds for gardens they might never plant in soil they might never reach. They walked toward hope the way water flows toward the sea. The council watched in silence. "This is not rational," one of them said finally. "Hope is a resource. It depletes. These creatures act as though it replenishes." "Agreed. It is why I brought this to you. They do not hope because they expect to succeed. They hope when success is least likely." The council considered this for what humans would have called a very long time. "We must observe directly," they decided. "We must understand how this functions." The decision was significant. The archivists had not descended into a single reality since before the current universe existed. Direct observation meant taking forms, limiting themselves, experiencing time as a straight line from past to future. It meant becoming, in some small way, less than what they were. But the question was too important to leave unanswered. 3 archivists would go. They would observe 3 humans across 3 different eras. They would watch and record and try to understand why creatures who should have been crushed by existence instead chose to stand up and walk forward. Chose the subjects carefully. The first was Maria, a young woman in 14th century Florence. A plague was sweeping across Europe, killing 1 in every 3 people. Maria's entire family had died in a single week. Mother, father, brothers, sisters, the grandmother who had taught her to make bread. All gone. The logical response was to flee, to hide, to wait for death. Maria did none of these things. The second was a poet in a 20th century gulag. He had been arrested for writing words the government did not like. Now he lived in a frozen work camp where prisoners died daily from cold and hunger and beatings. His body was failing. His spirit should have followed. But something strange was happening in his barracks, something the camp guards could not explain. The third was a captain on a colony ship in the 23rd century. Humanity had finally reached for the stars, but the reaching was not going well. Her ship was damaged. Life support was failing. The destination was 40 years away. The mathematics of their situation was brutal and clear. They would all die before they arrived, yet refused to tell her crew to give up. The 3 archivists descended into human perception. They took forms that would not shatter mortal minds. They moved through time the way humans did, one moment following another, unable to see what came next. It was uncomfortable. It was limiting. It was necessary. Arrived in Florence in the year 1348. The city smelled of smoke and bodies and fear. The streets were empty except for the dead and those who collected them. The churches were full of people praying to a God who did not seem to be listening. Maria was digging a grave. 7 graves, actually, arranged in a row behind what had been her family's home. She was alone. The neighbors who should have helped were dead or gone or hiding. Her hands were blistered and bleeding. Her face was empty of tears because she had already cried all of them. Watched from a distance, expecting the collapse. This was the moment, surely. The moment when the weight of loss would crush her. The moment when hope would finally drain away and leave nothing but the darkness. Maria finished the last grave as the sun set. She stood looking at the fresh earth for a long time. Then she walked into her empty house, gathered what medicine she could find, and walked to the neighboring village. There were sick people there, strangers, people who had never done anything for her and never would. Maria knelt beside them and began to work. A local priest found her the next morning. He asked why she had come, why she was helping people who meant nothing to her when her own family lay fresh in the ground. Maria looked up at him with eyes that held no hope of reward, no expectation of heaven, no calculation of benefit. "Someone must remember how to be kind," she said, or what was any of it for? Had no response. The words did not fit into any equation. The archivist recorded them carefully and continued to watch, waiting for the understanding that refused to come. Across the centuries and realities, the other archivists were watching too. They were seeing things that made just as little sense. And somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, the Elder Council waited for their reports, not knowing that the answers would change everything they thought they understood about existence itself. The gulag sat in a frozen wasteland where the winter never fully ended. Snow fell for 8 months of the year, and during the other 4 months, the ground turned to mud that sucked at prisoners' boots like hungry mouths. The camp had no official name, just a number, because names were for places where people were supposed to survive. Had been there for 2 years. He no longer remembered what warm felt like. His fingers were blackened from frostbite. His ribs showed through his skin like the bars of a cage. The guards had beaten him so many times that his left eye no longer opened all the way. He was 34 years old and looked like 60. The archivist who watched him had taken the form of a shadow in the corner of the barracks. No one could see them. No one could sense their presence. The archivist simply observed, waiting for it to break. He should have broken long ago. The mathematics were clear. A human body could only endure so much cold, so much hunger, so much pain. A human mind could only process so much loss before it shut down, had passed every threshold. By every calculation, he should have been an empty shell, waiting to die. Instead, he was telling stories. Every night after the guards locked the barracks doors, the prisoners would gather around bunk. 40 men who should have been fighting over scraps of bread, who should have been hoarding their strength, who should have been too exhausted to do anything but sleep. Instead, they sat in the darkness and listened to a poet speak. Told them about spring, about the way the ice on the Neva River would crack and groan before finally giving way to the rushing water beneath, about the smell of lilac bushes blooming in the courtyards of Petersburg, about his wife's laugh which sounded like bells, about his daughter's hands, small and warm, reaching up to be held. None of the prisoners believed they would ever see spring again. They knew the statistics. They knew how few people walked out of camps like this alive. But they listened anyway, and something changed in their faces as they listened. Something the archivist could not name. When finished speaking, the men would return to their bunks in silence. But the silence was different from the silence of despair. It was the silence of people holding something precious, protecting it from the cold. The archivist had observed thousands of prison camps across hundreds of civilizations. In every other case, hopelessness spread like disease. The strong preyed on the weak. Kindness disappeared. Survival became the only value, and survival meant cruelty. This barracks was different. Men shared their food, even when sharing meant going hungry. They tended to the sick, even when tending meant risking infection. When one prisoner could not work, others covered for him, knowing the punishment they would face if caught. The guards noticed but could not understand. They increased the work quotas. They decreased the rations. They pulled out for special beatings, trying to break whatever it was that held the barracks together. Nothing worked. The prisoners kept helping each other, and at night they kept gathering to hear speak. The archivist recorded everything but understood nothing. Hope was supposed to fade when conditions worsened. It was supposed to be rational, tied to evidence and probability. These men had no evidence that tomorrow would be better. They had overwhelming evidence that it would be worse. Yet here they were, passing hope between them like a flame cupped against the wind. One night a new prisoner arrived. He was young, maybe 19, with the soft hands of someone who had never done hard labor. He had been arrested for distributing forbidden books. He sat on his bunk with empty eyes, shaking, clearly expecting to die. The other prisoners let him be at first. They knew the look. Everyone had worn it when they first arrived. But after the evening count, after the guards locked the doors, crossed the barracks and sat beside the boy. "Tell me your name," said. The boy looked at him with confusion. No one here had asked his name. No one had spoken to him with kindness. He said his name was. Nodded, he asked about his family, his home, the books he had loved enough to risk everything for. The boy answered hesitantly at first, then with growing strength. Other prisoners gathered around. They listened. They asked questions. They shared their own stories. By the time the barracks fell silent for sleep, was crying. But they were not the empty tears of despair. They were the tears of someone who had remembered what it meant to be seen, to be known, to matter. The archivist had expected the boy to die within weeks. New prisoners rarely survived their first winter, but lasted the season. He lasted the next one too. When the archivist tracked the records forward through time, they found that eventually walked out of the camp alive, one of the few who did. He became a teacher. He spent the rest of his life helping others. When people asked how he had survived the gulag, he would tell them about a poet who had shared stories in the darkness. The archivist added this to their records and continued to observe, waiting for the pattern to reveal itself. Centuries away, on the colony ship, Captain faced her own impossible mathematics. The ship had been built to travel between stars. It carried 500 people and the hope of a new world. The journey was supposed to take 30 years. Then an asteroid had torn through the engine section, and 30 years became 40. Then a power failure had damaged the hydroponics bay, and their food production dropped by half. Ran the numbers every day. Every day the numbers came back the same. They did not have enough food. They did not have enough air recycling capacity. They did not have enough time. The third archivist watched from inside the ship's computer systems, observing every decision made. They waited for her to announce the truth to her crew. They waited for the panic, the despair, the slow collapse that always followed when a community learned it was doomed. Did not make the announcement. Instead, she called a meeting. She gathered her crew in the common room and told them they had problems, big problems. She laid out the facts without hiding anything. The damage, the shortfalls, the timeline. Then she asked for ideas. The crew stared at her. They knew the facts. They could do the same mathematics she had done. What was the point of ideas when the situation was hopeless? Waited. Finally, a young engineer named Park raised her hand. She had a thought, she said. Probably stupid. Probably would not work. But she had been thinking about the damaged engines, and she wondered if maybe there was a way to reconfigure them, to use the broken parts in a different way. It was a wild idea. The kind of idea that would never survive a review board back on Earth. The kind of idea that broke half the rules of standard engineering. Told her to explain it. For the next 3 hours, the crew debated. They argued about physics and chemistry and the limits of their equipment. They sketched diagrams on every available surface. They brought up objections, and others found ways around the objections. They were animated in a way the archivist had not seen since before the accident. In the end, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan. The mathematics still did not quite work, but the gap between death and survival had narrowed just enough that hope could fit through. They got to work. The archivist watched them tear apart functioning systems to build something new. They watched them work double shifts, skipping sleep, pushing their bodies beyond safe limits. They watched crew members who had barely spoken before become partners, then friends. They watched a community that had been fragmenting pull itself back together around a shared purpose. The plan worked partially. It bought them time, but not enough. So they made another plan and then another. Each one narrowed the gap a little more. Each one gave them another reason to keep going. The archivist could see the ending now, looking forward through time. The ship would arrive at its destination, 12 years late and running on the edge of failure. Only 300 of the original 500 would still be alive, but they would make it. When they did, they would name their first settlement after Park, the young engineer who had raised her hand and shared a stupid idea that probably would not work. The three archivists reunited in the space between realities, their observations complete but their understanding still empty. They had watched humans face impossible odds and refused to surrender. They had recorded the behaviors and the outcomes, but they still could not answer the fundamental question. Why? Proposed a theory. They had been thinking about it since watching Maria walk into that plague village. Humans, they suggested, had evolved differently from most conscious species. They had developed awareness in a universe that promised them nothing. No certainty of survival, no guarantee of meaning, no evidence that their existence mattered at all. Other species, the ones who fit neatly into archivist equations, had evolved with assurances, predictable environments, clear hierarchies, knowable futures. Their hope was rational because their universes were rational. Human hope was not rational. It could not be rational. It was something else entirely. It was defiance. Humans hoped not because they expected to win, but because giving up felt like agreeing with the darkness, like telling all the people who had hoped before them that their hopping had been foolish, like betraying everyone who might hope after them. The Elder Council considered this theory in silence. Some of them wanted to dismiss it, to classify humans as an anomaly and return to their endless. But others, including, felt something new stirring in the ancient depths of their consciousness, something that might have been, in a different context, curiosity, or perhaps even hope. The Elder Council had existed since before the concept of existence had meaning. They had watched the birth of physics, the first stirring of matter, the long, slow dance of gravity and light that eventually became stars and planets and life. Nothing surprised them anymore. Nothing had surprised them for longer than human minds could comprehend. Until now, stood before the council and presented their theory about human defiance. The other two archivists supported it with their observations of and Captain. The evidence was clear. Humans did not hope because hope made sense. They hoped because the alternative was to surrender, and surrender was something their species had never learned to do. The council deliberated for what humans would have called centuries, though in the space between realities, time meant nothing. Finally, they reached their conclusion. The humans are an anomaly, one of the elder voices said. Their behavior does not fit our models. We will note this in the archive and move forward. But did not accept this. No, they said. The word rippled through the space between realities like a stone dropped in still water. No archivist had ever refused a council decision. The concept of refusal did not fit their nature. They were observers, recorders. They did not disagree. They did not resist. Disagreed, they resisted. We cannot simply note this and move forward, they said. We have observed something unprecedented. A species that generates meaning from meaninglessness. A species that creates hope from nothing. If we do not understand how they do this, then our archive is incomplete. The council considered this for another long stretch of timelessness. What do you propose? They asked. Continued observation answered, but different, not from outside, from within. The council understood immediately, wanted to do more than watch. They wanted to participate in human existence. They wanted to experience hope the way humans experienced it. They wanted to feel the fear and the pain and the uncertainty that made human hope so remarkable. This was unprecedented. It was possibly dangerous. An archivist who became too human might lose themselves entirely, might forget what they were, might become trapped in a single reality forever. The council debated, but as they debated, something strange happened. Notice that the council's arguments had begun to change. The elder voices were no longer simply discussing protocol and procedure. They were discussing meaning. They were discussing purpose. They were asking why their archive mattered, why understanding mattered, why anything mattered at all. They were asking questions that had no rational answers. Realize something then, something that changed everything. The archivists themselves had been operating on hope all along. They had spent billions of years' existence not because they had to, not because some law of reality forced them, but because they believed understanding was valuable. They searched for meaning across infinite realities because they could not accept that reality was meaningless. They recorded and preserved and studied because they hoped their work would matter to someone, somehow, someday. They were, in their own ancient and incomprehensible way, just like the humans they had been studying. Shared this observation with the council. For a long moment nothing happened. The elder voices were silent. Then, slowly, the silence changed. It became something like wonder. The council did not punish for their defiance. Instead, they did something they had never done in all the billions of years of their existence. They created a new entry in the Grand Archive, not a species file, not a planet survey, a concept. Hope, the practice of acting as though the future deserves effort, especially when evidence suggests otherwise. First observed in primitive forms across many species, perfected against all probability by humanity. Note, may be contagious. Exercise caution. Further study required. The Council granted permission for continued observation. More than that, they assigned additional archivists to the project. For the first time in their history, the beings who watched the universe decided that understanding might require more than watching. It might require becoming. Return to Earth one last time. Not to Florence in 1348 or the Gulag in the 20th century or the colony ship in the 23rd. They chose a different moment, a different place, a different kind of observation. They took the form of an elderly person sitting on a park bench in a city that could have been anywhere. It was autumn. The leaves were turning gold and red, and the air carried the first hint of winter cold. People walked past on their way to work, to home, to the thousand destinations that filled human lives. A young woman sat down on the other end of the bench. She was crying. Not dramatically, not loudly, but with the quiet tears of someone who had been crying for a long time and had grown tired of it. She looked at her phone, then put it away. She stared at the ground. Her shoulders shook. In all their billions of years of existence, the archivists had never interfered with the subjects they observed. They watched. They recorded. They did not act. Acted. They moved closer to the young woman. Not too close, just close enough that their presence could be felt. The woman looked up, startled to find someone nearby. Her eyes were red and empty. She looked like she was waiting for something, though she could not have said what. Spoke. The words came from somewhere they did not fully understand, somewhere that had not existed in them before they began studying humans. I do not know if it gets better, they said, but I will stay here with you while we find out. The young woman stared at them. She did not know that she was speaking with a being older than stars. She did not know that her species had been the subject of cosmic study, that her hope was considered a miracle, that the simple act of getting up each morning made her part of the greatest mystery the archivists had ever encountered. She only knew that a stranger had seen her pain and chosen to sit with her in it. She started crying harder, but somehow the tears felt different now. They felt like they might have an ending. "Thank you," she said. They sat together as the afternoon faded into evening. The woman eventually stopped crying. She took a deep breath, then another. She looked at the sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. She said she should probably go home. She had things to do tomorrow. She was not sure what, but she would figure it out. She stood up, thanked again, and walked away into the gathering dark. The archivists stayed on the bench and watched her go. They felt something strange moving through them, something that was not observation or analysis or understanding, something that was more like the sensation of standing on a cliff edge, uncertain of what lay below, choosing to jump anyway. They felt hope. In the spaces between dimensions, the other archivists watched. They saw what had done. They saw the change in one of their oldest colleagues, the way participation had altered them in ways that pure observation never had. Some of them were afraid. Change was not supposed to happen to beings like them. Stability was their nature. Eternity was their purpose. But others felt something different. They felt the stirring of a question that had never occurred to them before, a question that had no answer, a question that was somehow more valuable because it had no answer. What else might they become if they allowed themselves to try? The archive continued to grow. It now included not just observations of humanity, but reflections on what those observations meant for the observers. The archivists were learning that understanding was not a destination but a journey, and that the journey changed the traveler. On Earth, humanity continued its long, strange walk through time. They suffered. They failed. They hurt each other and themselves. They made terrible mistakes and refused to learn from them. They did all the things that had convinced the archivists that hope was irrational. And they continued to hope anyway. They built hospitals in war zones. They wrote music in times of plague. They planted trees they would never see grow tall. They taught their children to be kind in a world that was often cruel. They reached for the stars, and when they fell short, they reached again. They did not do this because they were certain of success. They did it because the doing mattered, because each act of hope was a message sent forward to everyone who would come after, a message that said, "We were here. We tried. We believed it was worth trying. Now it's your turn." The message passed from generation to generation, carried in stories and songs, and the simple daily choices of people who refused to give up. It crossed oceans and centuries. It survived wars and famines and every catastrophe that should have ended it. And now, unknown to the humans who kept passing it forward, the message had traveled even further. It had reached beings who existed outside of time, who had watched the universe since before it began. It had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. In the spaces between realities, the archivists continued their work. They observed, they recorded, but now they also wondered, they also questioned, they also hoped. And somewhere on Earth, a young woman who had been crying on a park bench woke up to a new morning. She did not know what the day would bring. She did not know if things would get better. But she remembered the stranger who had sat with her in her pain, and she remembered the simple truth they had shared. We do not know if it gets better, but we stay, we find out together. She got out of bed. She made coffee. She looked out the window at a world that had given her no guarantees and never would. Then she went out to meet it anyway. Because that was what humans did. That was what they had always done. And somewhere across distances that could not be measured, beings older than time were watching and learning and slowly, impossibly, beginning to understand.